Folks on the live stream can't see, but this room is completely packed, and it doesn't make me nervous at all. But last year, I talked about a couple of things that I love. I talked about sharing, and I talked about inviting in our outliers, and I talked about making the whole world UDL rock stars. Today, I'm going to talk to you about three things that make me angry: indifference, exclusion, and fear. And I think those three things are preventing us from reaching the full potential of universal design for learning. But first, I'm going to start with a story. Once upon a time, there was a student in a wheelchair, and he couldn't get into the school because of a big set of stairs out front. He couldn't get into the school, so he couldn't get into the classroom. He couldn't get into the classroom, so he couldn't get to the learning. That student didn't have access to the learning environment, and that wasn't fair. One day, a group of scrappy young adventurers. That's David Rose, by the way, if you can find him in there, with an actual brown beard. Not gray. One day, these scrappy young adventurers came along, and they decided to help. But they didn't just want to get that student in the wheelchair in the school. They wanted to get that student in the wheelchair to be able to participate in every bit of the learning. And so they thought up UDL, Universal Design for Learning, what we know of as Universal Design for Learning. And they took what they knew from the learning sciences and cognitive neuroscience, and they molded it and shaped it, and it was good. They put the emphasis of the disability on the school and not the child. That school made that child disabled. It was disabling. It wasn't the kid's fault. So they brought together these ideas that variability is the norm, that learning is for everyone, that the purpose of education is not to make information accessible, but rather to teach learners to transform accessible information into usable knowledge. And then UDL began to spread. All throughout the land, educators were embracing learner variability and talking about learner variability and talking about UDL and researching UDL and thinking UDL and being UDL. And moving from access to building their knowledge to internalizing that knowledge and trying to reach the goal of every learner in their classroom is an expert learner. And they lived happily ever after. Or did they? In the excitement of the new examples of universal design for learning in classrooms and the new examples of universal design for learning in technology, in ed tech products, I feel like we forgot to ask a basic question. Have you considered accessibility? Not is it accessible, but have you considered it? Because we know for a fact that not everything can be fully accessible for absolutely everyone. But if you're not considering it, and you're not asking others to consider it, that means that you are not reaching the full potential of what we can actually do here. You're leaving those students at the bottom of the stairs. So I go to a lot of education conferences. Oh, a lot of education conferences over my 20 years in education. And I overhear things. So I like to people watch. I kind of sit by myself and I'm quiet and I'm working on my computer. And I hear things and sometimes I write them down. So I want to share with you a couple of things that I've heard at education conferences that people have said. Teachers have so much to do already. we don't have time to think about accessibility. It's not designed for those students. We have another option for them. I don't need to think about accessibility. I never have those kids in my class. Now, these aren't bad people. These aren't bad people, they're educators. And they're doing the best with what they know at the time. But they are symptoms of larger problems. They're symptoms of those three things that I talked about: indifference, exclusion, and fear. We need to move past these things to be able to realize the full potential of universal design for learning. So I'm going to talk about how we can try to do this. Eli Wiesel said, "The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference." So how do we combat indifference? With love. So if you're one of those people who think, well, I never have those kids in my class, you may not have the kids in your class that need the accessibility, but what about the parents at home who are looking at the newsletters that you're sending home, or that are helping their kids with their homework, or the grandparents that are, helping them get through the day, or the other family members that are, the brothers and sisters who are at home too, and trying to look, what are you doing over there? Oh, if I can't access it, okay, well, I guess I'm not important. Show them the love that you love their families too. Take baby steps. It's okay to do one step at a time, one little tiny thing at a time to make something better. You don't have to do it all. It's just like UDL. You don't have to do it all. You can take baby steps. Give yourself permission to do that. Forgive yourself for not doing it all the time, but don't forget. If you do not intentionally, deliberately, and proactively include, you will unintentionally exclude. This is a great quote from Joe Gerstant. He's a diversity and inclusion consultant and author. John Mundorf uses this quote all the time, and I just love it. Because if we're not intentional, we're not being inclusive. Make inclusion your default. If you only have one choice that's accessible to one of your learners in your classroom, you're not giving them options. You're telling them that I only have one thing for you to do today. The other stuff is not for you. And as Joni Degner said yesterday, everything we do in our classroom is communication. So what's that communicating to you, to your learners? So reflect on, did that work? What were some barriers that I didn't anticipate? And redesign it. And then reflect after that, and redesign it. And reflect after that, and redesign it. That's what makes teaching fun. It's not doing the same thing every year. I do the Flower Lab on Tuesday, March 20th, every single year. I want to iterate on that Flower Lab, right? I want to make it personal. And please be intentional. Please think about every single learner in your classroom and every single future learner in your classroom and in your world. We are a society that treats people with disabilities with condescension and pity, not dignity and respect. This is from Stella Young. She was a disability activist. She's Australian, a writer, and a comedian. When I think of pity, especially when it has to do with people with disabilities, I think of that pity as actually fear. Fear of the unknown, fear that I'm going to do something wrong or say something wrong or feel something wrong, or I don't want that to be me. And that's okay. We just have to own that fear. We have to change that fear into a challenge. We have to challenge ourselves. We have to ask questions. The next time you're at an education conference, or you're choosing a new tool for your classroom, or you're adding a new curriculum to your arsenal of stuff that you have for your learning environment, ask the person, have you considered accessibility? And if they give you a blank look on their face, that's an opportunity, that's a challenge. Say, you know, I've learned all this great stuff. Have you heard of WCAG 2.0? Actually, 2.1 is up for reauthorization. Do you know about that? Do you know about that stuff? And if they still give you a blank look, or they say, well, our stuff isn't for those kids, I challenge you to say, then I will not use your thing in my classroom. Define your non-negotiables. We don't like to say that we have non-negotiables in UDL. We have some non-negotiables in UDL. And one of those non-negotiables, for me, is it has to be accessible. I do a lot of the social media for CAST, and a lot of people send me some really great stuff to share. Lots of videos, lots of articles. I have to say to people, if it's not accessible, I can't use it. If your video doesn't have captions, I can't put it out there. I'm not willing to do that. But I also see it as an opportunity to say, hey, have you heard about this? It's really easy if you do it on YouTube. It basically does it for you. You just have to edit the transcript, right? Yesterday when I was tweeting about the accessible social media, Natalie Shaheen, who I hope is watching, tweeted back to me, and she's like, you know, video descriptions are actually really helpful too. So captions are great for people who are hard of hearing or deaf or learning English, or, you know, I mean, I use captions when I watch movies, just so I can catch the dialogue. But captions aren't great for somebody who can't see the screen. So if there is action going on in a video, that there's no verbal cues happening, that video needs audio description. Or maybe when they're making the video, think about that. From the design, design for accessibility, design for everyone. If you think about it from the start, if you leave that bottom third of your video for the captions, then you don't have to worry about the captions covering the bottom. There's lots of stuff we can think about. And expect a bumpy ride. But think of it as a challenge. Embrace that fear as a challenge. Because we don't want to leave anybody at the bottom of the stairs. We want to stop doing that. We want to stop hearing about average UDL. We need to be exceptional, or it's not going to work for everyone. This is actually one of my favorite Maya Angelou quotes, and I use it when I talk about accessibility. She said, "I did then what I knew how to do. Now that I know better, I do better." It's okay not to know everything, and it's okay not to do it all the time. But now that you know better, do better, please. So when we go back to the UDL guidelines, a lot of people think, well, accessibility must only be in the access row. If you actually go back and either watch this talk or look at my slides, hardly any of that stuff that I talked about was in the access row. It's completely embedded in the UDL guidelines. It's completely embedded in the UDL framework. And that's how UDL can be the Trojan horse for accessibility. Now, if any of that hasn't convinced you, and you're still kind of like, well, maybe, I don't know. I still don't have those kids in my class. I don't know. Then design for your future self. Because accessibility is not about them. It's about us. Thank you.